The Cardinals got about as good of news as they could have hoped for from Jordan Walker's knee injury on Wednesday. What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of B-Schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer hopping on here to update folks on the situation surrounding Jordan Walker and his left knee injury. Now, the news on this came out yesterday, so you've probably heard by now, but wanted to just throw my 2 cents out there and break down the situation as I see it. The takeaway is it's good news that Jordan Walker did not suffer any structural damage to the left knee, according to Oliver Marmol and the reports coming out from Jupiter. We'll read this tweet from John Denton, STL Cards manager Ollie Marmol, on Jordan Walker's left knee soreness. Quote, "Great news. Structurally, everything is in a good spot. Some inflammation above the knee, and we will take about a week to let that calm down and then ramp him back up." That probably means even more than a week before he'll be back in Grapefruit League action. I heard the audio from Ollie Marmol talking about this with media members on Wednesday, and it sounds like they're going to be really, really cautious with him. And why wouldn't you be? It's still early March at this point. The Cardinals have about a full 3 weeks from today before opening day. So if he is no activity for a week and then ramp up for a week, that still gives you a handful of games potentially that last week of spring to be able to get him in. And that's maybe on the more conservative side. Inflammation, they want to make sure that's got an opportunity to calm down and then begin to ramp him back up. But I think by now, with where it's happening this early in the month of March, I think there's every opportunity for Jordan Walker to still be good to go by the opening day roster period. Now, is that a guarantee that he'll be ready by opening day? No, I don't think you could make that proclamation at this point because they don't really know how the knee is going to respond. There is a little bit of an injury there. If you talk about inflammation, that's still an injury. That's still something that they are going to be very careful in monitoring. And, we'll kind of go from there to see as far as when they're going to ramp him back up. But the question was asked as to whether that would be a week without games or a week. And the way that Ollie answered it was like, no, we're thinking maybe a week. We're going to give him a week, and then we're going to go from there and see. So wouldn't expect to see Jordan Walker over the next week in Grapefruit League action, and then hopefully, get back to a practice or two, warm-ups, batting practice, the whole bit, taking some outfield work. I think that'll be honestly the main thing because injured himself in the outfield. And what a completely ridiculous way to get hurt, right? Not blaming Jordan Walker for it. Why is there a sprinkler head that pops out and he trips over it during the... I understand you've got to have, I guess, like a sprinkler system. It is Florida, though, so you'd think it rains enough that you wouldn't need to water the grass. But how is that something that is prominent enough in 2025? We don't have the technology to make sure outfielders aren't tripping on sprinkler heads. Like when he's tracking that fly ball, he's not looking at his feet to see where the sprinkler head might be. He's looking at the dang ball and making sure to catch it, which he did, and threw it back in with no problem, but then kind of grimaces a little and experiences the pain in the knee, and that's how the Cardinals make the decision to take him out and get him checked out, which was the right decision. I mean, definitely want to be precautionary in spring, and it's just good news that he had no structural damage because that would have been an absolute shame for the Cardinals to be banking on and eagerly awaiting Jordan Walker's revival this year and seeing what he's able to do in a bounce-back capacity, and for a knee to be something that takes him out. You really didn't want to see that, and it seems as though the Cardinals for now avoided the worst-case scenario where it's a tear of something and it needs to be repaired. Could have been meniscus, could have been ACL, MCL, LCL, all the various CLs that can get you when it comes to knee injuries. And you don't see as many of them necessarily in baseball. They happen for sure. I think Mike Trout was a prominent example last year where he had something similar happen. I don't know that a sprinkler head was involved, but kind of issues with the knee that lingered for him throughout the year. And like I was saying, though, you see those types of injuries a lot more in basketball, football. I know Kyrie Irving in the NBA just tore his ACL for the Dallas Mavericks. Things are not going well for the Dallas Mavericks. But it's just very fortunate because anytime you hear something like that, like with pitchers, if you start hearing about elbow, you're like, oh boy, like this ain't going to be good. I don't know what the update's going to be, but it's not going to be a pleasant one. And with knees, just in any sport, I immediately am like, well, I know that almost the best case scenario is if you see a play happen that's like notable and you're like, yeah, that there's something that happened in the knee, you're hoping for maybe meniscus that can be, sometimes they can do a surgical intervention that in football, for instance, guys might only be out for a number of weeks. But in baseball, man, and really in any sport, you talk about a knee, and if there is a tear of any capacity, even like a sprained knee, it just ends up being an absolute headache. So for inflammation above the knee to be the only thing that they have ascertained from this, and you say like a non-contact injury, which, I mean, as for the knee, anything's going to be non-contact. Like, you could have a really bad contact knee injury if you're playing football and somebody tackles you. The knee wasn't usually the thing that was contacted, although that can be the case sometimes. Rashee Rice, I think, had that with Patrick Mahomes. But, you know, the fact that there was no other person there, it wasn't like it was a collision, and you just tense up thinking, oh, man, you know, he did something, he stuck, he jammed. His cleat was jammed basically onto the sprinkler head for just a micro moment that I think, you know, caused something to kind of twist in a way that it wasn't supposed to. But hopefully just seems like a minor thing that they said it was good news. I think Ollie even maybe said the phrase great news, good news, great news in terms of what it could have been versus what it ended up being. So that's good to see for the Cardinals. Kind of a bummer for Jordan Walker. I mean, obviously a bummer for Jordan Walker. That's because anytime you're dealing with an injury, it's not what you planned, not what you wanted. But a bummer for Jordan Walker because he started to turn the corner a little bit in spring, had a pretty slow start. Remember, he had maybe 0 for or 1 for with a bunch of strikeouts. I think it was 0 for his first 9, potentially, something like that. And had the day before a pretty good game where he was starting to put some things together. And now you have the stagnated, truncated version of your spring. Hopefully he's able to get out there sooner rather than later. But again, I think the Cardinals are going to be pretty cautious when it comes to him because of the part in the calendar that you're in. And look, even if it wasn't the part in the calendar that you're in, if this happened the week before opening day, he'd be on the IL to start the season, I think, if that were the case. But it wouldn't be like the calendar is going to dictate that you need to rush things along and try to, you know, risk a further injury when it comes to Jordan Walker, because it's a really important year for him. And I think he's very important to what the Cardinals are hoping to do. If the Cardinals are going to be successful, if they're going to surprise people, I feel like it's going to have to come from guys like Jordan Walker kind of stepping out and performing above what they did last year. Guys like Nolan Gorman. I kind of went through the entire roster in a lot of ways and talked about what I expected and who I thought could maybe do more, or really I thought the way I was framing it was guys that the Cardinals need to see do more in order to surpass their 83 win total from last year. But I guess, and I got some comments on YouTube of people saying, well, you know, that's just kind of rose-colored glasses because there's no guarantee that the guys who performed okay last year are going to continue to perform at that same level. What if they have a fall off, and that's where your lack of production comes from? And that's, I mean, there's definitely the possibility of that. And I thought I tried to outline that in the last video, but if I didn't do a very good job of that, yeah, like guys like Wilson Contreras had an 848 OPS. That's really good. If he does that again, you're really glad that he was able to match last year's production. But even if he falls off to like an 800 OPS, that would be, you know, a notable 6 or 7 or 8% decline in his production. I still think he'd be a productive player for the Cardinals. Guys like Brendan Donovan, 750 some odd OPS. Like, yeah, he could be worse than that. And Burleson could be worse than the 730. And Mason Wynn could be worse than the 720 OPS that those guys put together. And if they are, then obviously you have to make up that production somewhere else. I'm not predicting that all the guys who had solid seasons last year are going to just do the exact same thing. We're definitely operating in the land of if with this Cardinals team, for better or worse. I understand why outside expectations aren't necessarily as high. I just tend to see things through the lens that as long as, which again, that's a big if, but as long as the guys who performed capably last year can somewhat match that production, I just look at the number of players that the Cardinals are going to be relying upon in notable roles who had bad years last year. And this year, the sentiment is basically we're putting those guys in and we're going to keep them in rather than try to rescue them after they have a bad start. We're going to give them the runway to be able to play through some struggles. And if guys like that, like Walker, like Gorman, like Michaelis and Matz. And look, I don't think that applies to Michaelis and Matz, but if those guys perform better than their numbers last year, it'll keep them in the rotation. If Michaelis and Matz don't have ERAs in the 5s, but instead have ERAs in the low to mid 4s, they'll keep their jobs. If they don't, if they are as bad as they were last year, ERAs in the 5s, then I don't think they'll have their jobs past the first couple of months of the season. I think the Cardinals are going to be willing to pull the plug on underperforming players that are veterans that are on one-year contracts. Michaelis, Matz, and then in the case of Helsley, Fedde, I don't think we expect those guys to struggle. But those guys could potentially be replaced if the Cardinals are not competitive as they want to be. those guys could be traded away in the month of July for hopefully a return that's going to help the Cardinals' future. So I still think it's an interesting season coming in. A lot of people have kind of asked this question to be like, are you even excited? You don't have to lie. Are you excited to cover this Cardinals team? And I really am, because I think it's so darn interesting, the number of varying opinions that people have about what this season's going to be. As much as I think the public sentiment is mainly very low on the team and complaining about them having an inactive offseason, which they did nothing. Like, I'm not covering that in rose-colored glasses, the fact that they did nothing in the offseason. I'm not praising that. I'm going, same thing as you. I'm like, yeah, it would have been nice to have done something. What was your goal? Was it to trade away older players to make room for younger ones and see what you have in those guys? If so, you failed. They didn't trade Arenado. But it's interesting that I was not necessarily ever convinced that trading Arenado was going to make them better in 2025. So now that the season's here and we start to think about this Cardinals team less in the mode of hypotheticals and more in the mode of, like, that day they're playing a game, sure hope they win it because it's more fun if they do. It's kind of like, yeah, maybe having Arenado here is for the better, even though it reflected a failure on the front office's part. The front office is going to change after this year anyway, so for only a few more months are you going to have to lament that, oh, this front office hasn't really been able to accomplish the goals that even the self-made goals that it sets for itself, that people in the public wonder if they should even be doing that in the first place. And some of those are influenced by ownership too, so I don't necessarily think it's just going to mean, oh, Chaim comes in and everything changes. I do think Chaim Bloom is going to have a different way of going about some of these situations than John Mozeliak has had, but also I think Chaim Bloom has a different set of circumstances that he'll be working toward than what John Mozeliak has in 2025. And you could say that this is to the detriment of the Cardinals, and I couldn't necessarily disagree with you. Like, the long-term scope of the Cardinals, it could be to the detriment of that team, that the person in charge of these personnel decisions right now only has to answer to them for the next handful of months. So, like, he's inclined to want the team to be better in 2025. I think John Mozeliak is going to do his due diligence and his best to match the organizational, how do you frame it, the way that the Cardinals want to move forward and the goals that they have for beyond 2025. I don't think he's going to just go in direct opposition to those goals intentionally, but it sort of happened this offseason that those goals weren't met in a very passive way, right? Because the goals were to, object at rest tends to stay at rest. The goal was to put some objects in motion and do something that was not just a passive offseason. It was to trade away Arenado so you could free up payroll. That helps the ownership group and be able to kind of give more runway to some of the young players that you could find out about. And they were willing to do that at the expense of a few extra wins this season. The fact that it didn't happen, though, I don't think is a detriment to the Cardinals in 2025 because, well, they're probably going to have a few more wins this season. And honestly, I think by the time you do get around to trading Arenado, because it would be unlikely at this point for him to finish out his contract in St. Louis, still got 3 years to go, but including this one, so 2 years after this one, I think his trade value is unlikely to be any lower than it was this offseason. There were teams that didn't want to have anything to do with him because of his performance last year. And it was the teams that he wanted to go to. They said, we'll stick with Max Muncy because Arenado's not really a difference maker. Like, that was the take. They didn't say that. They didn't have to. Like, they did it. They said it with their actions. Arenado said, I want to go to these 5 teams. One of them said, we'll take him. And then he came back later and said, never mind, I don't want to go there, or at least not right now, which was obviously not ever going to work because he didn't have the leverage. The Astros were going to move on with their offseason. So the other 4 teams that he wanted to go to, genuinely, probably would have said yes to any one of them if the Cardinals had a line to trade with those teams. They didn't want him, and it's, I think in certain cases it would have been sensible to take advantage of the Cardinals' desperation, where they were basically just saying, eat some of the money, not even all of it, pay Arenado's contract in part, and the prospects, that you'd be giving up to get him would be very minimal, and kind of go from there. Like, this was a good time to buy low on Arenado, in my opinion. Doesn't mean he's going to rebound, but you look at the track record, unless you think he is hitting the wall now, the aging curve, and this is the best you're going to get from him moving forward, I don't happen to believe that. I don't think he's going to return to MVP caliber, but I think an OPS between 750 and 775, maybe even a little north of that if things break right, is certainly within play. And I think he's still young enough to expect that little bit of a bounce back after last year. Maybe it doesn't come, but I just have a hard time believing he's going to be substantially worse than he was last year offensively. If you feel he is going to be, then let me know in the comments, and that's, a fine viewpoint to have. I would have said the same thing, in fairness, after 2023 about both Arenado and Goldie, and then they were both substantially worse. So those things can certainly happen. But I would look at that as, Arenado, this was probably the time to buy low on him. Whereas if he does have a bounce back, the Cardinals should have less trouble unloading him in either July at the trade deadline if the Cardinals aren't competing, or if they are competing, then you keep him and you talk about it again next offseason, ideally after a season in which Arenado has performed better. And even if, let's say, the Cardinals are in a playoff spot in July, so they don't actively trade away players, but then they get to the end of the season and they fall short, they win 83 games again, and they're not in the playoffs, Arenado will probably still want out. So you can revisit all the talks in the offseason next year. I just think it's a situation where if you're the Cardinals and their fans, you are in a spot now that we're living in the reality of early March 2025 to say, all right, they have a decent chance to have Arenado around, which means they win more games this year than they otherwise would have. And then you're just looking at all those other players to either bounce back or stay the same and have enough of those things happen to keep, because again, we're operating from a place of the Cardinals were not dreadful last year. They won 83 games. They weren't great. They weren't even good, but they were fine. And they could be fine again with better luck, or they could be fine again with worse luck, in which case they're probably closer to 76, 77 wins, which is close to what they were supposed to have last year based on the run differential. But no, I don't think I have been painting anything in a way that's overly rosy. And if you feel I have, predict it. Like, go ahead. If you're one of those who say, I'm tired of listening to this show where you talk about how it might break right for the Cardinals despite the fact that they did nothing in the offseason. If you feel that way, that's okay. Just make sure you mark it down. I want to hear it in the comments right now on YouTube. It shouldn't take you long. Give me your season win total prediction. I'm curious because I haven't given mine yet, and I will before the season begins as we see some other things break down and how some of these position battles will unfold. But I would say that right now I'm very close to thinking this is going to be a 500 baseball team, give or take, is probably where I'm going to end up. And that keeps you within the couple of standard deviations from the mean. If you have a range of outcomes that potentially ends up on the higher side, this team could still make the playoffs. But I don't think I am out here painting the rosy picture that, there aren't some issues with the way the Cardinals went throughout this offseason if their goal was to try to win a bunch of games. Unfortunately, I say for better or worse, but it stinks for the fans that it doesn't seem like their goal was to try to win a bunch of games. Not in the way that the ownership group and the front office approached the offseason. That being said, they didn't really achieve their goals of making the team markedly worse by trading away a 10-time Gold Glover at third. So you might accidentally be a little better than you intended to be. Could it be to the detriment of the future of the team? Perhaps. But I also don't actually think that's the case. Enough injuries probably happen that they still find out whether Gorman is good or he stinks. And I saw on Sports Hub STL the other day, Randy Carricker saying if he could just be Gorman, if Gorman could just be Kyle Schwarber with a bunch of home runs but a bunch of strikeouts, then the Cardinals would take that. And I think they'd be popping champagne if he had Kyle Schwarber's career arc, because Kyle Schwarber also has historically a pretty good on-base percentage because he walks a lot, and Gorman's plate discipline does just not really match what Schwarber's has been and certainly has become over the years as he has developed in the big leagues. But I think he's gotten better with the batter's eye as he's gone, and maybe Gorman can mirror that. But right now, he certainly profiles as a hitter that's pretty boom-bust, and there's been more bust than boom recently. But I still think you're going to find out what Gorman is. And the main reason to have traded Arenado, I think, was to have a better runway to find out what Gorman is. And I still think, despite the fact that Arenado's here, you'll be able to accomplish learning that. And I don't care about his defense. I don't care about where Gorman plays in the field. If it's third, if it's second, it doesn't really matter. He can DH. Can he hit or can he not is really what's going to decide whether he is a guy that's long for the Cardinal organization or if they end up giving up on him in the next couple of years because he didn't meet the offensive profile that they were hoping for. I still think they find that out. In the other part of trading Arenado that would have benefited, well, who would it have benefited? It would have benefited the ownership group because they would have saved some money. But I don't necessarily buy into the fact that, if they save money now, it means they'll spend more later. Nah, you might as well spend it. I'm not really going to cape for the ownership group to that extent that, it stinks that they couldn't move him because I wanted ownership to save money. No, I didn't. So it's fine that they're having to pay him because it makes the team a little bit better, which is better for people who are watching the team this year. And in terms of did they give up an opportunity to get prospects back for him? Not really, because I don't think they were getting prospects back in the first place. They were going to get some couple of names, but guys who are non-prospects and lottery tickets more so than anything, just to, make it feel like a trade. More than anything, it was going to be about the Cardinals getting rid of that money, which I don't think fans should be compelled to care about and to be upset that it didn't work out that way. And like I said, if anything, if Arenado does get traded in the next 12 months, ideally, it's after he rebounds a little bit and is worth more, and maybe you do get some prospects for him because there is less financial implications of a trade down the road because this year is one of the higher valued years on the deal. Next year is the same, and then it actually goes down. The financial commitment goes down for the third year of the deal. So a team that would be looking to bring him on, if he rebounds and has an 800 OPS this year, let's just say, I don't know that that's likely, but let's say that he does that, suddenly you've got less of a long-term commitment. You're closer to the end of the deal that makes a team believe, hey, he can still replicate this production for the next couple of years for the time that we would be responsible for him. Maybe it becomes more of a willingness for teams to trade for him and to give up something to do it. So I know we started with Jordan Walker. There wasn't a lot more to say about his injury, but I guess it launched me into this notion of Walker is one of those guys that the Cardinals will need to see a lot from this year, or at least more from, if they're going to be any better than they were last year. And what they were last year was not bad, but it wasn't good enough for people to really feel like they could get behind and see that this organization is moving in the right direction again. So we'll see what ends up happening with how long he ends up being out and how the Cardinals will handle the rest of their spring. I guess one more note before we get out of here was a recent report by Derek Gould that the Cardinals are maybe still kind of kicking around the idea of adding a veteran reliever to the mix, and I think that only makes sense if they don't bring Nick Anderson along for the opening day roster. And he's not looked good so far, so we'll need to see him have some bounce-back efforts, I think, before he's worthy of a roster spot. But the Cardinals might have had it in their heads that, we're going to add him eventually before the season begins because he's not on the 40-man. But they kind of figured, I'm saying if they figured that we'll add him when the time comes, when we figure out who to DFA or if we have an injury that necessitates somebody being on the long-term injured list, the 60-day, to free up a 40-man spot, then we'll add him as long as he's healthy. And I can't tell if it's bad pitching because he's not healthy or bad pitching because he doesn't have it anymore. But I have not been impressed at all with Nick Anderson, despite the fact that he is a MLB The Show 2020 legend, as I've talked about on the video game. He was really good for me that year when I played a lot of the show because of COVID. So we'll see if he ends up kind of turning things around. And if he does, I don't really think the Cardinals need a veteran reliever because he could kind of be that veteran reliever. And then you've got enough. You've got Helsley, you've got JoJo Romero. I think those are the two guys that don't have options. And then if Nick Anderson was number 3, you'd have him in place as somebody that couldn't ride the Memphis shuttle. And then you decide about lefties, if it's John King, if it's Liberatore. Both do have options. Liberatore right now is still part of the starter conversation. We'll see if he eventually kind of slides into more of a relief role as we get closer to March 27th. And so those are a couple of guys that you would have potentially on that side of things. And then on the right side, it's going to be a group of guys. Roycroft, Leahy, number of different guys. Ludus is in that conversation. Obviously, I think Ryan Fernandez makes the team. He's not in that Memphis shuttle conversation, but he could be because he does have options and is no longer in the situation that he was in last year where the Cardinals couldn't option Ryan Fernandez because he was a Rule 5 pickup. So he could be in that conversation as well. Maybe Riley O'Brien's certainly in that conversation. Maybe Roddery Munoz and Tekoa Roby shift from being starters to relievers and could be in that conversation at some point. Just speculative on that front. And Gordon Graceffo, I think, is the other name that's really interesting that you circle because he's also looked good as a starter. Starters inherently more valuable than relievers, but have we seen enough of Graceffo in AAA to where if he looks good in spring as he's done so far, the Cardinals say, forget it. We'll just put him on the roster and he'll be in the bullpen and be one of those guys that could be eligible to be shuttled back and forth, depending on what the need is for fresh arms from time to time. So I think with one veteran reliever in that spot that Nick Anderson could occupy, you're set. But does this new report from Gould happen because it's kind of like the notion that, well, maybe the Cardinals don't exercise their opportunity to add Nick Anderson to the active roster, and they're still maybe looking for somebody in that bucket. What I would say I would be opposed to is going out and signing the most expensive available free agent reliever. I think it would probably be David Robertson, and he could make $8, $9, $10 million potentially. I wouldn't do that. It reminds me too much of the Greg Holland thing where you felt like at the end of camp you got a little, maybe they should have done it in the offseason that year and they would have had a better chance with him. But I think by the time you signed him, it was a little bit forced, and they didn't have him ramp up in the minors, and he didn't seem to be in game shape when the season began. And it inspired my infamous tweet. I don't know if it's infamous, but it was to me, where I, at one point, after watching Greg Holland get beat to hell over and over, I said, have you ever seen $14 million crammed into a blender? Because that's basically what the Cardinals did when it came to Greg Holland's contract. I don't know if it was $11 million or $14 million or what it was, but I don't think that's really worthwhile for a team that's, been trying to save money. I would try to find another diamond in the rough. I would bring back Keenan Middleton. I would bring back somebody in that tier for $2, $3, $4 million, just if you felt like you needed somebody that's better than Nick Anderson. And if you don't feel like you need somebody better than Nick Anderson, I don't think you need them both. I don't think you need to go spend on a reliever and have Nick Anderson. That's an area where, it could be to the detriment of the bullpen, but you could also learn about some of these other young guys that you've been touting for a while, but you haven't given consistent opportunities to. Through no fault of the team on that. Like last year, some of those guys got chances, but they were shuttled to Memphis pretty frequently. And you had like Andrew Kittredge, that was obviously somebody that was a staple to the bullpen. In a year that you want to learn about guys, I don't think you need to go to free agency to add somebody at Andrew Kittredge money who's not probably going to produce like Andrew Kittredge did last year, and thus be blocking more of those opportunities for the young players. So I think I only would look to that market if the Cardinals are giving up on the Nick Anderson thing, which I don't know if they are or they aren't yet, but we'll have to look at what his additional opportunities are the rest of camp to see if he gets up to speed in time to be a legitimate candidate for the opening day roster. Okay, that's going to do it for this edition of the show. Appreciate you guys so much for listening. Thank you for all the support, and we'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.